But verse 17, the seventh angel poured out his bowl upon the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne saying, "It's done." So the realm of evil, if you will, has taken a pretty big hit. Really, not just Rome, but the whole of the ungodly world has taken a pretty big punch or two. And here it is again, confirming what we had seen in the chapter before, where you have God's faithful people standing with the Lamb on Mount Zion saying, it's a done deal. God has said, here comes my wrath, here comes his wrath. And then the seven bowls are poured out and they say, that's game, that's done. Verse 18, this is kind of the epitome of horror as we kind of close this part out. There were flashes of lightning and sounds and peals of thunder. Again, this is the vision that John is seeing. There's a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. The great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And Babylon, the great, was remembered before God to give her the cup of wine of his fierce wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. And huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each, came down from heaven upon men. And as we've already looked at before, with other bowls and other trumpets being sounded, right? So here's an earthquake unlike man has ever seen since the dawn of creation, so much so that the great nation is split into 3. John refers to it as Babylon the Great, which is what we'll really touch on today. Huge hailstones, 100 pounds each, falling on these people from heaven, and you would think, surely now some men are going to repent. Surely after all of that, again, it's ironic that people today read the book of Revelation and they think that all of these things, again, premillennialism, all of this is symbolic of stuff that's happening today, right? And we haven't gotten to it quite yet necessarily, but, so-and-so is the Antichrist, and that means he's going to do this, and then the 7 kings, or, the 10, whatever, that's these people, and the river Euphrates is drying up. And so that's how we know that the war is cut, and all of this is happening now. And so you have people who are standing on the street corners and saying, the time is now, look in the news, Revelation is coming true right before your very eyes, repent, and scaring people into God, essentially, which is not a good way to do that. And it's ironic that we are doing that today, but this is a vision that John has, which, if you'll remember, chapter 1 says these are things that must take place soon. So John is not referring to 2023 in 79 AD. These are things that must take place soon. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of hail, because its plague was extremely severe. So the people that this was written to, and it was written to the church, but it's also a pretty fair warning to those in Rome who are working against God's people. Here's all these terrible things that's going to befall Rome, and you would think they would be standing on the street corner saying, listen, we have angered the one true God by persecuting his people, and we need to repent and change our lives. And you'd think they would be on the street corner shouting that out. No, they continue to blaspheme God for sending the hail. Still will not repent and turn to God. So the 7 bowls have been poured out, and in essence, in this vision that John is seeing, we've come to the part of this vision where judgment on Rome is complete, and Rome is destroyed. And we could sit here, I did it a little bit when I talked about Mount Vesuvius, right? We can go and look at history and what it is that happens to Rome, again, Mount Vesuvius and some other things that happen to destroy them. And a lot of history would prove that to be true in things that happened to Rome. This morning, as we get into the lesson we're meant to, Revelation chapter 17, this, I don't want to say it seemed unimportant, but I thought we're kind of getting away from, for lack of a better term, the freaky stuff. And now it's just sort of the epilogue. And I thought, it's important for us to look at, but it's just not as maybe interesting. But then I remember that the whole reason we started the study on the book of Revelation is because premillennialism is such a prevalent teaching. Even if somebody isn't premillennialist, there's probably even members of the Church of Christ who maybe haven't studied Revelation out of fear, and they've just adopted some premillennialist teachings. Say, well, I believe in the gospel and the doctrine, all of this is good. I just also think that, the rapture is real or Armageddon is real, because I haven't really read Revelation. I'm not really sure. Revelation chapter 17 and 18, and I don't know that we'll make it to Revelation 18 today, but Revelation 17 is the obituary for the great city. And the reason that's so important for us to look at is, as we begin chapter 17, the 7 bowls have been poured out, judgment is complete, and now we're going to have, kind of strangely, a short biography of the deceased. And I'll say this, as you read through Revelation 17, I think you'll find some similarities between Rome and the United States. You'll probably, honestly, if we were in Russia, if we were in China, if we were in other places, we'd say, wow, I see some similarities here. I would say that this applies to most great nations now, today. But it's important that we read and study this obituary and who John is describing. And it's not us. It's not 2023, United States of America, here comes Armageddon. It's talking about Rome. And so let's take a look at this obituary. Again, it's covered over 2 chapters, and we may just have time for the first half of it. But verse 1 of Revelation 17, one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I shall show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters." You're going to hear that word a lot. I don't know. It doesn't make me uncomfortable. It's just weird saying the word harlot so many times because it's definitely not in my vocabulary from day to day. But John tells us who the great harlot is. Later down in verse 18, the woman who you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So we have a good idea of who the harlot is. But to build up to that, and this is something that gets confused and lost a lot as well. Verse 5, John is going to speak about the great harlot, or speak of the harlot as being Babylon the Great. So, again, as I've mentioned before, you may disagree with me as far as where Revelation, or when Revelation was written. If you're an late 70 AD kind of person, or if you're an early 90s AD kind of person, no matter which side of that you fall on, this can't be the literal Babylon for many reasons. First of all, it's way over on the Euphrates River. That's a small thing. But John says that this woman, or harlot, is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. So John would be referring to a city that is reigning in his day. So that would place him maybe around 79 AD. And Babylon didn't rule over the kings of the earth. Rome did, which we've talked about that, and we'll review it again this morning. Babylon didn't rule over kings of the earth, but Rome did. In fact, in 330 BC, when the Persian Empire falls to Alexander the Great, the city of Babylon is completely destroyed. It's just wiped. So if that happens in 330 BC, and here is John writing roughly around 79 AD, it couldn't be literal Babylon. Historically, the last time that Babylon was even mentioned on Babylonian clay tablets was in 10 BC, which would have been roughly 89 years before John writes Revelation. That's the last time Babylon wrote about Babylon on a clay tablet, was 10 BC. So at the time John receives this revelation, I mean, Babylon had, again, 89 years is a while. It's long gone and was not currently ruling over anything. Rome did, however, so his reference to Babylon is to draw a parallel that just as Babylon was a harlot in its day, and just as Babylon was destroyed for that, so will Rome. And again, if you think back to Daniel seeing the vision or the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar has, right? You are Babylon, he's the top of that statue, and then the bottom of that statue is Rome. So we've come full circle. The vision that Daniel has, Daniel was here, John is seeing it from here. So verse 1, John says, the great harlot sits on many waters. Handful of things to say about many waters. And the word sit as well. Because the word sit here can mean dwell, which is where the harlot, where the city resides. I do not have a map of the Roman Empire during its peak, but if you look it up, you will find that it sits on the waters. And there's another meaning behind the phrase sits on many waters down in verse 15. He said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations in tongues. So in that case, sits on many waters doesn't necessarily mean just the physical location where Rome is sitting, but it also means symbolically the harlot sits on these many people. So the great harlot ruled or controlled these many waters, these multitudes, these nations of people. Rome did that. Rome did rule over various kinds of people. In fact, that's part of what made Rome the powerhouse that it was. Rome would make alliances with other nations nearby, which sounds strange, but, Rome would go into a nation and they would go to their enemies who they would have otherwise slaughtered, and I'll give you an example here in just a moment, and essentially say, instead of killing you all, you can join us instead. So a little bit of inclusion. If you'll pledge loyalty to the Roman Empire, we'll spare you. But of course that means you'll have to live under our rule. So for example, the Romans conquered the region of Palestine, but again, part of what makes Rome so great is not that they live in Rome and then just wasteland everything else, but that they'll go into, for example, the region of Palestine, and instead of killing all the people and all the animals and burning everything down, they say, look, we'll to minimize the cost of this battle, to minimize the conflict of securing an area by military force, let's do this instead. Rome will come into Palestine and we'll take over, but what we'll say is, look, this guy here can be your king. He reports to us, but it's somebody you know, and that way it's not such a big conflict. So Rome doesn't necessarily come in and wasteland everything, but they'll come in and say, we're taking over, but we'll let you have a representative, a king, who answers to us, but is your king. And that's what they did to minimize conflict and cost. Just as long as whatever king they put in place did what was best for Rome, and as long as that region stayed loyal to Rome as they should, everything's fine. And that's why, really just before Christ was born, you find Herod, who is a descendant from the tribe of Edom. He is king, but Herod answers to Rome. So Rome did that all the time in many, many regions. And so that's another way or another meaning behind the great harlot sits on many waters. Yes, Rome was, if you look at its height, it did sit on many waters, but symbolically later on down in verse 15, the waters referring to people, nations, and tongues. Yes, Rome did rule over quite a bit. So, again, that furthers the point that the harlot here is Rome. And there's another reason why the angel here speaks of her sitting on many waters. The angel is describing, and I'm sure John is seeing, right? Because she said, the angel says, let me show you, right? The harlot that sits on many waters. And the angel is going to show John Rome's beauty, her place of prominence, her place of influence, her power. Come look at the harlot and see why it was so alluring and why they were so successful, and look at the beauty of the city. And that's important because John is going to see, and the people reading this are going to see, look how magnificent Rome was. And now look at its destruction. It's one thing to read and to see the fallen city, the great harlot, taken down. It's another thing to have seen, I guess, the before and after, right? This is how beautiful it was, and look at its destruction. Here's someone who was sitting in such a lofty place, taken such a long fall all the way down to the bottom. So to read that again, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and spoke with me, saying, "Come here, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed acts of immorality, and those who dwell on the earth were made drunk with the wine of her immorality." So we're talking more about Rome's alliances. The places that Rome took over, not only would those nations participate in Rome's wealth and participated in Rome's power, but they also participated in Rome's ungodliness. And I gave you a list a while back, quite a few chapters ago, of some of the things that were prevalent in Rome. And again, I think I mentioned last week, I had seen a post online about how LGBT-friendly Rome was. And it's kind of sad. That's true to an extent, but then also you have to consider that the biggest piece of that were grown men taking young boys as sex slaves, essentially. You want to call that LGBT-friendly? I wouldn't. It's awful no matter what way you spin it, whether it's accepted or whether it's forced, but you want to call that LGBTQ-friendly? Not quite. And it wasn't just Rome doing those things. Rome would take over nations, and the nations would join in on the customs, I guess, and the things that are being done. I've never said this ever in my life, but I thought it was a good phrase. They lay down with the dog, and they come up with fleas. Verse 3, "He carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And again, we jumped over to this chapter and talked about this, so I'll give you a brief overview, but this is just a reminder. We don't have to speculate who the beast is, right? We talked about that. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, so these are colors of royalty. So this woman is wearing royal colors on the outside. She's distinguished on the outside, but on the inside it's disgusting. The woman is clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her immorality. She's full of all this sinful, ungodly behavior, and she is so ready and so willing to share that cup with others who will partake of it. However, those who partake of the things that the beast is essentially moving through this nation will be destroyed, just as the woman sitting on the beast will be. Upon her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, which, again, is weird for me to say, but I mean, this is the mother of all harlots, who teaches all the little harlots how to be like her. That's what's written upon her forehead. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. It's not enough that she would be wealthy and powerful, this great city, this harlot. It's not enough that she is so entrenched in ungodliness and wickedness and evil in her time. It's not enough that she takes over other nations and requires them to participate. Why does this kind of sound like us today? I'm going to mention this later on in the sermon, by the way. It's not enough that we do these things, but that we want you to join us in accept us in doing these things, and you will join us in doing these things. And that it's not enough that she does all of that, but she thrives on the blood, sweat, and tears on Christians, on those who follow Christ, those who are faithful to God. She's drunk on the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. It's not enough that she does all of those things, that she is involved in the sinful things that she's doing. It's not enough that she has to gather everyone to join her, but that she also has to persecute those who would dare step against the things that they're doing. And when I saw her, I wondered greatly. In other words, I think John is saying, who is this that I'm looking at? Right? Because, again, this is a vision. I can't stress that enough, right? If you're looking up in the sky for a woman dressed this way, sitting on, you're not going to find it. It's a vision, but what a vision to see. What am I looking at? And the angel said to me, verse 7, why do you wonder? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. And again, this is a bit of a... I can't think of the word. We've already talked about this. But I'll go through it again just really quick. The beast that you saw was and is not. Which, by the way, if we can just step outside of what we're reading, and again, it's very serious. It's kind of funny for me to read that, for John to see this vision, and he wonders within himself, what am I looking at? And the angel says, what do you mean? It's the beast that was and also is not. And if I were John, that is a non-answer. I have no idea what that means. What am I looking at? Well, it's the beast who was and also isn't. Doesn't make any sense. The beast that you saw was and is not and is about to come out of the abyss and then go to destruction. And those who dwell on the earth will wonder, whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that he was and is not and will come. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. So is it getting much clearer to John? She's sitting on the beast, the 7 heads, the 10 horns, and, well, it's the beast that was, isn't, and will be. And when it does come, it will ultimately go to destruction. And so what she's really sitting on are the 7 mountains, which, as we discussed, right here in Oklahoma, what we consider mountains, other people might consider hills. But if you look at the map of Rome, Rome did sit among 7 mountains or hills. And that's always been an identifying feature of Rome. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There's 7 kings, 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other's yet to come, and when he comes, he'll remain a little while. And then the beast which was and is not is also himself an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for an hour. Again, we covered that back in chapter 13 when we talked about the scariest number of all time, 666, right? Which is the number of a man. What we saw is if 7 is completion or perfection, then 6 is failure, and 3 sixes is just terrible failure, just failure. So, as I said then, I'll repeat now, if it's on your license plate, or if it's, I don't know, in the number, I don't know what they call the number on like your dollar bill, but the little, it's not a SKU number, but identification number, whatever. You don't have to burn it or ask the cashier for a different $1 bill. It's just a number. And it's the number of man that's doomed to fail. But to cover that again, when we're talking about the beast, the 7 heads, and the 10 horns, and we talked about Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, John says 5 kings have fallen. And then there are 3 that aren't mentioned, and that's because Galba, Otho, and Vitellius were kings for a few months apiece because there was a massive civil war in Rome, so don't really count them. They didn't do a whole lot. Vespasian is the one who is, which is what also helps us place the book of Revelation. It was during Vespasian's rule. So these 5 have fallen. These 3 were worthless, so we don't even talk about them. Vespasian is then the one who has not come yet, but when he does, it will be for a short time, is Titus. He rules for 2 years, 2 months. So he's not in for very long. So that is the one who will come and won't be here for long. And then we talked about Domitian, who is the 8th, but also one of the 7. He is the son of Vespasian, which is the king who is. So he is the 8th, but he comes from the 7. He is the beast which was and is not, but when he does come, will ultimately lead to destruction. And again, I know we've already talked about all this, but under Nero, the saints, and again, Nero was the 5th one, which have all fallen away. But under Nero, the saints were severely persecuted. Christians were severely persecuted under Nero. And then when Nero died, the persecution ceased, and it is picked up every now and again by other emperors. But overall, right, because right after Nero, you have a civil war, so there's other things going on as opposed to persecuting Christians. But then by the time Domitian comes around, who is the 8th in that numbering, by the time Domitian comes around, the beast who was and is not but will be was sometimes referred to as Nero Redivivus or Nero Revived, because the beast reared its ugly head through Nero, and then after Nero dies, we have Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who are too busy trying to save their own lives than persecute the saints. And then under Vespasian, the time when John is writing this, there was some persecution, but need I remind you that he's writing to the churches in Rome, and if there was tight persecution, John's not getting a letter through to the churches in Rome. That's not going to happen. So there's some persecution, but it's not a national policy like it was under Nero. It was much more casual, so the beast is not. But then Domitian comes, and the persecution lasts until the year 311. So pretty good stretch of time there. The beast showed itself in Nero, dies, and is essentially resurrected through Domitian, again making it essentially a policy to persecute Christians. And the 10 horns which you saw are the 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for an hour. So we talked about those. Those are the client kings. And as we've talked about more in depth this morning, those are the people who perhaps Rome has taken over those nations, but said, look, you can have this guy. He can be your king, but not really. I mean, Rome gives him the power, and he answers to us. And if your king doesn't do what we like, we'll take him out. But sure, he's a king. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful. So, as is true through almost every chapter of the book of Revelation, what is meant to be an encouraging letter to first century Christians living under persecution of Rome, and what similar encouragement you and I in 2023 can get from reading Revelation, is that God's people will be victorious. And the reason why really is mentioned here in verse 13 is because Jesus is Lord of lords and King of kings. That's why. God's people will be victorious. Why? Because Jesus is Lord of lords. He's the King of all kings. And every man, woman, and child that refuses to give in to this sparkling cup that the great harlot offers to all and says, join me in what we're doing. We're big, we're powerful, we're beautiful. This wonderful nation that sits on the many waters, you come join us, accept us, participate with us. Every man, woman, and child who refuses that is victorious in Christ. That's what we find throughout the book of Revelation, especially up to chapter 17 here. And the word chosen here does not speak of election necessarily, but rather those who, it speaks of the choice or the best choice to make. Verse 15, he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues, and the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked and will eat her flesh and will burn her up with fire. So this is inner strife, because you're thinking, isn't the harlot sitting on the beast? Aren't they in cahoots? Sure, but there's inner strife, and that inner strife, the taking down from the inside, helps to aid in the fall of Rome. Why? Verse 17, God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose. So they are a part of God's judgment, and they don't even know it. And by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. We're halfway through the obituary of the deceased, and there's just a couple really powerful things there for us to think about. And I don't want to get too much into it, especially since we're out of time. But here's this great harlot that's involved in these great many, so much evil and defilement. And as we've read through Revelation, God says, okay, you want to be with the beast? You can be with the beast, but you're going to end up with the same punishment the beast gets. And when you get to the obituary for the great city that's fallen, God has put it into their hearts, go ahead, do what you're going to do. But what we find in verses 17 and 18 is that all the city had to do was follow the beast, and part of their destruction is just following the beast. Not that God didn't have to do anything. his wrath and his judgment rightly falls on those who are doing these things. But he says, you guys follow the beast, you're going to tear yourself up. And it's pretty wild when you consider, as I mentioned earlier, how similar some of the things we just read sound about us. And I'll repeat that Revelation was not written to the church in the United States of America today, but boy, are those warnings still just as applicable. And that here is this great harlot, this great city. It's powerful, it's wealthy. Accept the evil and the terrible things that we come up with. Participate with us in these things. And God says that's going to take you out from the inside. And a nation like Rome falls because they live against God. Not just because God's wrath falls on those who live against him, but because following the beast earns you destruction. And that's a pretty fair warning to the United States today and to any other country, especially one that's wealthy and powerful and involved in all measure of ungodly things. You're going to reap what you sow. You want to follow the beast, you follow the beast. But you're going to get beastly consequences because of that. That's all I've got, unless there's any comments or questions. Thanks, y'all.